into a sky bleached white with heat, and by noon, the air shimmered in waves that made the horizon dance and dissolve. This wasn't the pleasant warmth of early summer, when green grass ripples under gentle breezes. This was heat that cracked the earth open. Heat that turned once lush grasslands into expanses of brittle brown stalks that crunched under every step. The drought began in spring and never broke. April rains that usually soaked the plains and coaxed prairie grass to shoulder height simply didn't come. May stayed dry. By June, the creeks that normally ran year-round had become chains of stagnant pools, shrinking daily, ringed with the desperate tracks of cattle and wildlife competing for every drop. Ranchers watched their grasslands with growing unease, but not yet alarm. Bad years happened. The West was unpredictable. Surely the rains would come eventually. Surely this was just a temporary dry spell. They were running more cattle than the land had ever supported. That was the problem, though few admitted it. The cattle boom of the early 1880s had been intoxicating. Eastern investors and European nobility had poured money into Western ranching, seduced by stories of limitless grass and cattle that reproduced themselves into fortunes. Ranchers who'd started with a few hundred head now ran thousands. Some operations counted their cattle in the tens of thousands. The math was simple and irresistible. Cattle bought in Texas for $10 a head could be driven north, fattened, on free grass, and sold in Chicago for $40, $50, sometimes $60. The Great Plains were an enormous, rent-free feedlot. The grass was free, the water was free. All you needed was cattle and cowboys to watch them, except the grass wasn't limitless, and the water wasn't guaranteed, and running 10 times more cattle than the land could sustainably support worked fine until conditions turned bad. That summer, conditions turned very bad indeed. Prairie fires became constant. The dry grass ignited from lightning strikes, from careless campfires, from sparks off wagon wheels striking rocks. Once started, fires raced across the plains for miles, sometimes days, consuming what little forage remained. Cowboys fought these fires with wet blankets and desperate prayer, but mostly they just watched the range burn, knowing each acre of blackened stubble meant less food for the cattle that fall in winter. By late summer, water sources that had never gone dry in memory went dry. Springs that had sustained homesteads for years simply stopped flowing. Rivers that normally ran strong became braided trickles through wide, cracked mudflats. Ranchers began to panic, moving herds constantly in search of water and grass, often finding neither. The cattle themselves began to show the strain. They should have been fat and sleek, building reserves for winter. Instead, their ribs became visible. Their hip bones protruded. They moved sluggishly, conserving energy because they weren't getting enough food to burn. Range cows that should have weighed 900 pounds were coming in at 600, 700 if they were lucky. And still, the cattle companies shipped in more stock. The pressure from investors back east, from shareholders in London and Edinburgh who'd never seen a prairie or a longhorn, was relentless. Maximize the herd. Use every acre. The reports sent back to investors spoke of temporary setbacks and cyclical weather patterns, but projected ever-increasing profits. The cowboys knew better. In bunkhouses and around campfires, they talked about what was coming. You didn't need to be a genius to do the math. Cattle going into winter already weak, grass already depleted, and winter always came to Montana, always came to Wyoming and Dakota. The question wasn't whether winter would be hard. Winter was always hard. The question was whether the cattle and the men who tended them could survive it in their already weakened state. Then came the signs. The old-timers noticed first. In early November, almost a month earlier than usual, the geese began flying south, not in their typical leisurely migrations, but in huge, urgent flocks that darkened the sky and flew from dawn to dusk. They weren't stopping to feed in the prairie ponds. They were getting out. Beavers, whose lodges dotted every creek and river, were observed gathering more wood than anyone had ever seen. They piled branches and logs until their lodges looked like timber fortresses rising from the water. animals preparing for something. The cattle themselves grew thicker coats, not just the usual winter hair, but shaggy, dense fur that made them look like bison. Ranch hands joked about it nervously. "Looks like the cows know something we don't," they'd say, and try to laugh, but the laughter always sounded forced. Weather-wise ranchers, men who'd spent decades reading the land and sky, felt it in their bones. The air pressure fluctuated wildly. The wind patterns shifted strangely. The autumn sunset cast peculiar colors across the clouds, orange and purple and sickly green, like bruises spreading across the horizon. November brought the first snow, not the gentle, melting dustings that sometimes came and went in autumn, but real snow. Serious snow. It fell for 3 days, accumulated to 8 inches in places, and when it finally stopped, the temperature dropped below zero for the first time that season. That snow melted eventually, as November snow often did, but it served as warning. Winter was coming early. Winter was going to be serious. The smart ranchers, the cautious ones, began laying in extra hay, stockpiling firewood, bringing cattle closer to ranch headquarters, where they could be watched and, if necessary, fed through bad stretches. But most didn't. Most couldn't. The scale of operations had grown too large. You couldn't barn 20,000 head of cattle. You couldn't buy enough hay to feed them through a Montana winter even if you wanted to. The entire business model of open-range ranching depended on cattle foraging for themselves, year-round, regardless of weather. This had worked mostly for years. The previous winters had been unusually mild. Cowboys spoke wistfully of the winter of '85, when temperatures barely dropped below freezing and cattle grazed comfortably all season. Or '84, when snow came late and melted early. They'd gotten complacent. The land had been kind, and they'd mistaken kindness for weakness. In December, the unease grew. The air felt wrong, too still, too heavy. The sky stayed overcast for weeks, a low ceiling of grey that pressed down like a lid. Snow fell intermittently, never enough to cause real problems, but enough to dust the brown grass white and make foraging harder for cattle already struggling. Christmas came and went. Cowboys celebrated in bunkhouses with what meager supplies they had. Some ranches managed a turkey or goose. Most made do with beans and bacon and whatever whiskey had survived the year. They sang songs and told stories and pretended everything was normal, but the worry was always there. A cold knot in every stomach. New Year's Day, 1887 dawned clear and brutally cold, -20 degrees in some places, but clear. You could see for miles, the snow-dusted prairie rolling away to a horizon sharp as a knife edge. Cowboys rode out to check on cattle, found them bunched in coulees seeking shelter from the wind, but alive, still managing. For 8 more days, the cold held, but remained bearable, survivable. Cattle poured through snow to reach grass. Cowboys kept fires burning in bunkhouses and took turns on night watch. Ranchers' wives cooked enormous meals, knowing their men needed calories to stay warm. And then came January 9th. The morning started deceptively calm. The killing wind from the north that had blown for days suddenly stopped. The temperature rose, slightly enough that men went out without their heaviest coats. There was even talk of a Chinook coming, one of those warm winds that could raise temperatures 40 degrees in an hour and melt snow in a day. But this wasn't a Chinook coming. This was something else entirely. The calm before the storm isn't just a saying. It's meteorological reality. The stillness that morning was the pressure dropping, the atmospheric conditions realigning, the sky gathering its strength to unleash something that would be remembered for generations. By mid-morning, the first flakes fell. By noon, the world had disappeared into white, and the temperature, instead of rising, began to fall and fall and fall, until cold became something no one on the northern plains had experienced before, until winter stopped being a season and became an enemy that wanted everything dead. The autumn of warnings was over. The winter of death had arrived. The bunkhouse sat low against the prairie, a squat rectangle of rough-hewn logs chinked with mud and moss that had dried and cracked over successive seasons. It wasn't designed for comfort. It was designed to be built quickly and cheaply to house as many men as possible in the smallest space and to provide just enough shelter to keep those men alive through winter so they could work come spring. Most bunkhouses were single rooms, maybe 30 feet long and 15 wide, with a ceiling, so low a tall man had to duck under the support beams. The logs were never properly squared, so gaps showed between them, filled haphazardly with whatever materials were at hand. Clay, newspaper, old rags, horsehair mixed with mud. In winter, you could stand in the middle of the room and see daylight, through a dozen cracks, and where light came through, so did wind. The door was thick plank, hung on leather hinges because metal hinges were expensive and had to be freighted in from distant towns. It never quite fit the frame, so a gap at the bottom let in a constant stream of cold air that flowed across the floor like invisible water. Cowboys stuffed rags under it every night. By morning, frost would have formed on those rags, turning them stiff as boards. There was usually one window, if you could call it that, a square cut in the logs, covered with oiled paper stretched over a wooden frame. Or if the ranch had any money, actual glass brought in at considerable expense and constantly at risk of cracking in the cold. Most bunkhouses just had the oiled paper, which let in a murky amber light during the day and absolutely nothing at night. The bunks lined both long walls, stacked 2 or 3 high depending on how many men the ranch employed. Each bunk was nothing more than a wooden frame, rope webbing stretched across it in a grid. And on top of that, if you were lucky, a thin mattress stuffed with prairie hay. If you weren't lucky, just the rope webbing and whatever blankets you owned. The hierarchy of bunks was established and rigid. New men got the worst spots. Bottom bunks on the end nearest the door, where the cold draft flowed constantly and you'd be stepped on every time someone went outside to piss in the middle of the night. Top bunks were warmer because heat rose, but they put you closest to the roof where moisture from everyone's breath condensed and dripped. You'd wake with water spots on your blankets, sometimes ice if it was cold enough. Middle bunks away from the door were prime real estate, warmer than the bottom, drier than the top, away from traffic. Senior cowboys claimed these spots and defended them jealously. If you wanted one, you either waited years or fought for it, and fighting in a bunkhouse full of armed men rarely ended well for anyone. At the center of the room stood the stove, a cast-iron barrel stove or, in better bunkhouses, an actual manufactured stove with a proper firebox and damper. The stovepipe ran up through the roof, and where it pierced the ceiling, there was supposed to be a metal collar to prevent fires. There often wasn't. More than one bunkhouse had burned down from a too-hot stovepipe, igniting dried wood and old bird nests lodged in the rafters. The stove was life. When it was burning hot, the men closest could almost be comfortable. 5 feet away, you could still be cold. 10 feet away, in a corner bunk, you might as well be outside. The stove created a temperature gradient so steep that men on one side of the room would be sweating, while men on the other shivered under piled blankets. Feeding the stove was a constant concern. Firewood was precious. Trees were scarce on the open plains, and what wood existed had to be hauled in by wagon from river bottoms or mountainsides miles away. Some ranches burned coal shipped in by rail, but coal cost money, and ranchers were notoriously cheap about anything that didn't directly increase cattle numbers. More often, cowboys burned whatever they could find: dried cow chips, sagebrush, buffalo bones, of which there were still plenty scattered across the plains from the great slaughter of a decade earlier. None of these burned hot or long. You had to feed the stove constantly to maintain any heat at all. At night, someone had to take responsibility for the fire. Usually, this rotated among the men, with each taking a shift to wake periodically and add fuel. Miss your shift, let the fire go out, and you'd wake to find 20 angry cowboys ready to throw you outside in your underwear to see how you liked the cold. Even with the stove going, the bunkhouse was never truly warm in winter. It was less cold than outside, which was the best that could be hoped for. Your face would be hot from the stove, while your back was cold from the draft. Your feet would be numb while sweat trickled down your spine. Comfort wasn't the goal. Survival, was the goal. Make it to morning alive and functional. That was success. Cowboys slept in their clothes. The idea of changing into night clothes, or worse, sleeping naked, was absurd. You slept in your wool shirt, your long underwear, your thick socks. On the coldest nights, you kept your pants on. Your hat stayed on your head or under it as a pillow, because hats were expensive, and you didn't want someone stealing yours while you slept. Boots were the exception. You took off your boots because sleeping in boots was miserable, and because boots needed to dry. They'd sit by the stove all night, the leather slowly warming and releasing the accumulated moisture of the day. The smell of drying leather mixed with the smell of unwashed men, wet wool, tobacco smoke, and the acrid tang of burning sage or cow chips. The smell of a bunkhouse was indescribable to anyone who hasn't experienced it. 40 men living in close quarters, bathing rarely because hauling and heating water was labor-intensive and rarely worth the effort. Clothes worn for weeks or months without washing, because washing meant they'd be wet and might not dry in winter, and wet clothes could kill you. The privy was outside, so men used a bucket in the corner at night rather than brave the cold, and that bucket added its own special contribution to the atmosphere. Tobacco smoke hung in layers because every cowboy who could afford it smoked too, passed the time. Some chewed and spit into cans or just onto the floor because the floor was already a mess of tracked-in mud, snow, manure, and spilled food. Mice lived in the walls and came out at night to scavenge. You could hear them scratching and squeaking, see them dart across the floor in the stove light. Some cowboys tried to kill them. Most gave up. There were always more mice, as long as they didn't chew holes in your blankets or get into the food. Stores, you learned to coexist. The sounds of a bunkhouse at night were particular. The wind outside, constant, varying from low moan to sharp whistle, depending on its strength and the gaps it found. The stove ticking as metal expanded and contracted with temperature changes. The creak of rope webbing as men shifted in there. Bunks, the thump of boots being pulled off and dropped on the floor. Snoring. Dear God, the snoring. 40 men in one room meant you'd have at least 10 serious snorers. Deep, rattling snores that shook the bunks. High, whistling snores that pierced through any attempt at sleep. Snores that stopped and started, until you'd lie there waiting for the next one, unable to relax. Sometimes men would throw boots at particularly bad snorers. Sometimes it helped. Usually it just made everyone else laugh and the snorer angry. Coughing was constant. The cold, the dust, the smoke, the close quarters meant everyone had some kind of lung affliction. Dry, hacking coughs that went on for minutes. Wet, rattling coughs that made you wonder if the man would survive the night. Cowboys coughed themselves, awake, coughed themselves back to sleep, coughed their way through the entire winter. Conversations happened in the dark. Men talked about home, about women, about cattle, about anything but the cold pressing in from all sides. Some conversations were quiet, just between neighbors in adjacent bunks. Others involved the whole room, stories being told and retold, jokes that weren't funny but made everyone laugh because laughter was warmth of a different kind. Letters were read and reread by stovelight. A letter from home was precious, and a cowboy might read the same letter 100 times through a winter, memorizing every word, every loop of handwriting, every piece of news from a world that felt impossibly far away. Some men prayed. You'd hear whispered prayers in the darkness, usually from the younger cowboys, the ones still new enough to the work that death seemed like a possibility rather than an inevitability. Older hands didn't pray much. They'd made their peace with whatever was coming, or they'd stopped believing anything was listening. The bedding itself deserves attention. Each cowboy owned his own bedroll, a collection of blankets, and maybe a quilt that he'd rolled up and carried with him from job to job. These blankets were wool, heavy and scratchy, and they accumulated the smell of their owner, along with the smell of horses, cattle, campfire smoke, and prairie dirt. In the bunkhouse, you'd unroll your bedding onto the rope webbing, which sagged under your weight and provided almost no cushioning. The ropes left permanent patterns pressed into your back and legs. After a few weeks, you stopped noticing. Your body just accepted that sleep meant discomfort and adjusted expectations accordingly. On the coldest nights, men piled every blanket they owned on top of themselves. 3 blankets, 4, 5 if they had them. The weight was crushing, but weight meant warmth, and warmth meant survival. Some cowboys, the poorest ones or the newest, didn't have enough blankets. They'd sleep in their coats, under their coats, wrapped in saddle blankets that smelled of horse sweat and mold. The truly desperate would share bunks, 2 men pressed together for body heat, which was awkward and carried implications, but was better than freezing. You'd see this more in the deepest cold, when propriety mattered less than waking up with all your fingers and toes. Getting into bed was a shock every night. The blankets had been sitting in the ambient temperature of the bunkhouse all day, which meant they were cold. Not frozen, but cold enough that sliding under them made you gasp. Your body heat would eventually warm the space between blankets, but it took 20 minutes, half an hour, of shivering and curling into yourself before that happened. Some cowboys heated rocks in the fire and wrapped them in cloth to put in their bunks. This worked for about an hour, providing a spot of genuine warmth for your feet or your hands. After